It is quite late in the afternoon. I shall attempt to be brief, and depending on who you talk to, I may or may not have that skill. But anyway, so I'm talking today about 20 years in software development, because there we go. Because obviously, apparently 20 years is something to celebrate. It doesn't actually feel like it's been 20 years. I still remember a lot about my first job, believe it or not. I suppose part of that is probably because it's your first experience, and you remember it a lot more than anything else, really. What I can say though is 20 years does make you a lot more reflective, and what I'm going to try to do in this talk is maybe impart some of the things that I've learned over time. Now, my journey doesn't actually start 20 years ago. It starts a little bit before that. So does anybody want to take a guess for who is that in that very iconic picture? Any takers? I can't see the comments though, so it's a bit annoying.
Gates and Jobs.
Gates and Jobs, yeah.
Yes, a very young Gates and Jobs. This picture was taken in 1991, which is round about the time that I actually got into computers. Now it's quite an interesting inflection point of the industry at the time. So Steve Jobs at the time was basically wandering around in the wilderness. He'd acrimoniously left Apple in the late 80s. He started a company called Next. Now Next made absolutely fantastic platforms. It was great hardware, it was great OS, but it was just way too expensive, and Next simply never made any money. Jobs bought a company called Pixar. Now, Pixar actually started making hardware, so they actually did some of the graphics hardware to do some of the animation, and that's what Steve Jobs was actually interested in. The sideshow of doing animated movies was not of interest to him at all. And on top of that, he was a notorious micromanager. So he tended to micromanaging everything at the company. People absolutely hated working with him. In fact, several years later, he said like one of the hardest lessons he had to learn, was basically delegating and actually giving people responsibility and allowing them to shine in that role. Bill Gates, on the other hand, was about to conquer the world. So the year after this, Windows 3.1 would be released, and then 3 years later, Windows 95 was going to be released, together with a slew of other technologies that Microsoft brought out. Everything from AD to SQL Server all came out in the 90s. By the end of the 90s, Microsoft basically had controlled 97% of all internet traffic. So 97% of all traffic went through Windows and Internet Explorer. Now, my personal foray into computers was a second-hand computer that my dad got. This is a Commodore Amiga 500. It's got a 32-bit 8 megahertz Motorola 68K processor. Now, you wouldn't think that Motorola was a CPU company, but in fact, at one stage, they were almost the dominant player in the CPU space. In fact, the direct descendant of this is the PowerPC chips, which for a long time powered most of the gaming consoles, including the PS3 and the Xbox 360. It had 12K RAM. Mine was upgraded to 1 megabyte, and a 720K floppy disk drive. And something that was quite rare at the time, especially on PCs, was that it had a dedicated graphics processor. Something that if you got that on a PC would be fiendishly expensive. For me, though, this was basically pretty much a gaming console that came with a compiler. Now, I kind of lived in this whole anti-Microsoft sentiment. At the time, in the 90s, Microsoft was the bully on the block. There was actually a real concern at the time that Microsoft was going to completely dominate the internet, and that all open standards would be replaced by some Microsoft proprietary equivalent and basically lock anything out. One of the things that happened was in the late 90s, there was antitrust litigation against Microsoft. There was even a movie in the early 2000s called Antitrust, where Tim Robbins plays a villain that looks a whole lot like Bill Gates. And of course, at the time, Steve Jobs was considered a hero. fast forward 30 years, and things have changed quite a bit. It turns out that pretty much all companies are guilty of some form of evil. Something about wanting to, grow their slice of the pie and keep market share and, stay in business. So fast forward now to 2000, and this is when I actually started coding in anger. What you see there is a Sun Starfire server. It could support up to 76, 64-bit, and this was back in the late 90s, 64-bit UltraSpark 4 CPUs. These servers were the darling of the .com boom, okay? And they were the absolute epitome of big iron. Now, these were 76 CPUs, not cores. I just want to point that out, right? And you couldn't buy one of these for under a 7-digit figure USD. These things were used to run massive websites and databases, and this was just how we used to roll back then. If you wanted to run something, you got a really, really large piece of kit and you ran whatever it needed to run on there. Sometimes, of course, they would run both the application and the database. And for me, this was my first introduction to proper Unix. And when I say proper Unix, I'm not talking about Linux. Linux is a Unix-like operating system. It embodies a lot of the same principles, but it's not a derivative of the original Unix code like Solaris or OS X or any one of those is. Now, in this time, of course, you're pretty much on a learning phase, right? And I mean, this is typical of most developers, I think. For me, I was doing Java. Java was then still relatively new, and it was gaining a lot of features and tech at the time. On the side, I also did a lot of VB6 and COM, believe it or not. I used a lot of stuff which I shouldn't have, mostly because it was new and shiny. So to point out, if I had a hammer and I was trying to find a whole bunch of nails for it. I was quite lucky. I worked for a company and we did banking integration software for clients all over the world. And I was lucky enough, or so they say, to travel the world and actually go to the sites. This sounds very nice, but the problem with this is that most of the time when I did get sent out, it was normally to fix a problem or to go into some really awkward situation. And I did see a lot of the world, and I did also see a lot of the inside of banks. Talking a little bit about the tech environment at the time. So XML was the ultimate cool thing. Of course, SOAP and SOAP-based XML web services was a new technology, and Microsoft was going to make that the center of the new .NET platform. And basically, the bottom line is you weren't cool if you weren't banging XML docs via SOAP over HTTP. The company I was working for, we were building an integration bus, what would later be known as an ESB. Now, I think if we had been a little bit more astute and actually read the market at the time, I'd be doing this talk from a yacht in the Caribbean. But, well, hindsight is 20/20, as they say, I suppose. Now, this is something that's been a major portion of my career, okay? This whole sort of tribalism between Java and .NET. Around about the time that Microsoft was releasing .NET, the Java guys had released the J2E standard, and Microsoft marketing specifically went after Java. They specifically targeted Java as that which Microsoft was going to replace with .NET. And quite frankly, the Java community, instead of taking the high road, just replied in kind. And quite frankly, the result was this wonderful tribalism that we have. It's still around between the Java guys and the .NET guys, and it's just an interesting observation, and I'll talk more about it a bit later. But the reality is this is not how people choose things, right? When a company invests in the platform, they invest in the platform, and they expect to have a development platform that can actually take advantage of the vast sums of money that they've just spent on this platform. Java came out of the Unix world. It was never going to be a first-class citizen of Windows the way it's a first-class citizen in Unix. And quite frankly, up until recently, .NET didn't work on anything else except Windows. The bottom line is if you were running Linux, Big Iron Unix, or OS X, you were building in Java. If you were running Windows, you were building in .NET. And that's really how people made most of the decisions. This is around about the time where I think experienced the first major global shift, or global event that shocked the world in my career. Obviously, as you all know, this is 9/11. Basically, the 19-year anniversary of this is coming up in a week. I was actually in Geneva at the time, and one of the observations I made was that I never had seen so many people who were in so much shock. It surprised me, maybe because as a South African, we'd come through a lot of turbulent times in the 90s. I wasn't used to having such a harsh reaction to something like this. People were literally shocked to their core. It was as if the world had suddenly become a whole lot more uncertain. Now, you got to remember something about 9/11. Entire companies ceased to exist. A company's assets, their data, their equipment, and their office space, and in some cases, their entire complement of staff were literally wiped off the face of the earth. It was a shock to the world generally, and it changed the way that a lot of things worked. And I mean, we still feel some of the repercussions of this today. Out of interest, the company that we were doing work for, they had offices on the 23rd floor of the World Trade Center. Now, everybody in the office was evacuated, so nobody, there was no casualties or anything like that. But one of the things that happened was that a consultant had left a laptop with their entire code base for their core banking system just open on a desk. And obviously that laptop was never recovered. And to this day, nobody knows actually what happened to it. Whether somebody actually did recover it and maybe they looked at the hard disk and leaked it, or if it was just lost in all the rubble. This was really a nail in .com. It was obviously a massive knock to financials, and financials, just as they are now, are often the biggest purchasers of IT systems. It's also the only time I actually remember that developers were sitting without work. There was obviously a recession that resulted from this, and I don't think I've ever seen a time since then where there was no demand. Like, people left the career of software development because there was simply no work. So I spent the next couple of years honing my skills, doing a lot of web dev at different places. And then I became a senior. Was also my first stint at Dariel. The picture that you have there is probably the most interesting, or at least the biggest event of the year, which kind of tells you how much things had improved and calmed down by 2006. This was Zinedine Zidane headbutting Marco Materazzo in the 2006 World Cup final. And he obviously got sent off for this with a red card, and that was also how he retired. So one of the absolute greats of the game ended his career in ignominy. Something else that happened was this little low-key announcement. I dug this out of the mails that I got somewhere in my old Gmail mails, and it's quite amazing how low-key this announcement was. This, of course, is the announcement for Amazon EC2, which was announced on the 24th of August, 2006. I remember looking at this and we kind of talking in the office about what the benefit was, and obviously remember at the time that Amazon EC2 would have been quite limited. And what we concluded was, well, it's quite a nice service, but right now we don't really have a need for it. Now, if you think that was our response, what do you think the big guys like Google and Microsoft did? So Google does not get hosted infrastructure, bottom line. Okay, they were doing cloud, but it was kind of their own flavor of it. They wanted to hide the computer from you. This idea of actually hosting infrastructure was almost alien to them. And from Microsoft's side, he basically just did not get cloud point blank, right? I mean, he sort of regarded Amazon or Amazon Web Services as a with disdain for a long time, and eventually he came and he did launch the Microsoft Cloud, which came to be Azure. But really, it only gained traction under Satya Nadella. The other thing that started happening was that I realized that the knowledge I'd built up and acquired over the last couple of years was exactly what that picture is showing you there. It was really a trash can fire. I was feeling a severe sense of disquiet about the way things were being done. Part of this was I was looking at the way that we did things, the way that Java handled things, the way that my tooling was handled thing, and I started looking beyond just my own space. I wanted to see different ways of doing things. At this point in time, I was playing around with things like Ruby on Rails, Erlang, you know, all those tech, which was very cool at the time, and people were starting to do things with. And certainly the desire to learn things beyond just thinking about code was starting to broaden. Now, the next major crisis of the 2000s obviously was the 2008 financial crisis. So this was the second time that things went pear-shaped. We were actually quite spared in South Africa by this. I mean, there was definitely a recession, and we were hit, but not as badly as some of the other countries. Part of that might have been because of the whole NCA Act that had been signed a couple of years before. I think my biggest regret from this time was not buying a massive house in Northcliffe for 900,000. However, in the IT space, there was actually quite a lot of change happening, right? So despite the fact that there was a financial crisis, despite the fact that pretty much every economy was in the tank, Apple had released this little device that Steve Jobs is holding in his hands. Now, you must understand something about the iPhone. It's not that the iPhone had revolutionary tech in and of itself, right? It's not the fact that it was the first touch screen or had the first proper ARM OS or anything like that. It was the first time that I actually had a device, a mobile device that was nice to use. So it was pleasant, for example, to be able to surf the internet on my iPhone. It was pleasant to be able to type mails, something that I couldn't do on any phone that I had previously. At the time, I also tried my hand at coding some iPhone apps, which was quite an interesting experience. In fact, Apple still owes me $75, which unfortunately I will never get because Apple's terms, I'm not sure if this has changed in the interim, but at the time anyway, they'd only release money to you once you'd hit $100. And I think it took me longer to get through the review process than to code the actual app. Now, there's definitely a misconception sometimes around mobile app in terms of the amount of effort it takes to develop them. Mobile apps are just like any other app. They take a lot of effort to develop and develop nicely. And you know, this is a time that I actually discovered about how little vision there is amongst developers. So I put out a call to some of the developers I was working with, and the call was very simple. Look, you know what? There's this new platform, iPhone. The market is open. There's an opportunity here for us to make some money. You know, do you want to maybe come and work with me? The only response I ever got to that was something along the lines of, I refuse to work on a crapple Macintosh. And you know, you consider this and think, well, you know, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, let's just make money. And this combined with personal issues that prevented me at the time, I couldn't carry on. But it's still kind of an interesting thing to think about. Now, fast forward a couple of years, and I took on the role of architect. I became an architect in 2011 at Discovery Vitality. My job was basically to design, implement, and manage integration services for all of Vitality's offshore customers. So I did integrations for Vitality in the UK. I did integrations for AIA in Singapore and Australia. I did some interesting stuff in China with Ping An Health, which is almost a talk all on its own. And at one stage, I was doing integrations for partners in 5 different countries, and the work just never stopped. One of the things I learned about this is that as you go up, as you become more senior, the nature of the work tends to change, right? It's no longer just about the software and delivering the software. It's also about the politics. And you'd think that the people you work with have got the same vision, and that fundamentally their goal is to do the delivery of the software. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. And certainly something I can say, I don't think I was ever ready for the type of politics I had to go through when I became an architect. One of the things I learned is that systems are like this chocolate, right? The chocolate itself is just a carrier for the filling, right? So if you think about something like a Ferrero Rocher, people are after that hazelnut type filling that you get in there, right? It could even stand up by itself. And this is really what we tend to forget. And this is something you see when you become an architect, is that the center, the value proposition is the business. The software is just the chocolate, that's the platform that's used to deliver this whole thing, right? And as an architect, you realize that sometimes the chocolate is almost secondary. It's just a means to an end to deliver the value proposition that's in your squishy center. And people always forget the value, right? It often becomes more about the software. It's about how important that is, and that takes precedence. And sort of one of the side effects of this was that I burnt out at Vitality. I was diagnosed with chronic stress, and to this day, I actually still suffer from insomnia every now and again. So after that, I did a stint as a paper architect, which is also, well, it's not really interesting. I wouldn't consider it interesting, but certainly it was fun. It was a fun experience, and I learned a lot. And then after that, I came back to Dariel, which, as they would say, the rest is basically history. And you know, I'd like to share a couple of things that I've learned with you over that time. Now, these lessons to me, like these are hard-learned lessons, and you know, if anything I can say is maybe take this into cognizance, and hopefully it can help you a bit. So, I mean, I talked quite a bit about the tribes and tribalism, right? So the quote here is by Friedrich Nietzsche. In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epoch, it is the rule. And certainly this is something that you have to learn, right? At some point in your career, you have to step away from your group. If you don't, there's absolutely no way for you to become objective. And for good reason, right? You can only start thinking critically about your own group when you step out of it. And consequently, doing so allows you to look objectively at other groups. And there's no other way that I know that you can really learn to have different thoughts and be objective about it. And certainly, becoming an architect, this is a key skill that you have to have, right? You have to be able to look at things with pros and cons. And I'll be honest with you, stepping out of your tribe is really hard, right? It hurts. You're attached to, everybody wants to belong to a group, but you have to do it, even if you don't want to necessarily. The one thing I will say is that you have to step out voluntarily. If you don't step out voluntarily, normally what happens is you just become bitter, and then everything else you learn basically is just bad, if that makes sense. You know, because you didn't have any intention to really look critically at what you're doing. One of the things I've learned about this is that there's no bad technology per se. When technologies are made, they normally have specific objectives in mind for a specific context. And usually they work fine in that specific context. If you can learn to understand those contexts, then you're then you're halfway to understanding what the purpose was of the technology. And pretty much every technology works like that. So it's very important for you to try go and understand what it was that somebody was trying to accomplish with a tech that you're working with. Okay, so here we have old Sisyphus rolling his rock, and the only experience that is worth anything is the one that you gain quite painfully. I mean, I've talked a lot about the crises and things that happened, and certainly we're going through another crisis now in the form of COVID. One of the things that you should know is that it teaches you not to take things for granted. And that sometimes there are difficult circumstances that you actually have to work through. Developers are always chasing greenfields. But let me be quite honest, there is limited learning in a greenfields environment, okay? If everything is optimal, there's absolutely no way that you can actually test yourself. There's no way that you can objectively look at your own mistakes and recognize existing mistakes in the environment and work to fix those things. You have to remember that if you go into a less than stellar environment, that technology that you have to deal with, that legacy or that bad programming, at some point in time, that was also a greenfields development. And the developers working there had high hopes for what it was that they were going to build. And I'll tell you more, just from a personal satisfaction perspective, if you can learn to work through difficult circumstances, if you can take a bad situation and turn it around, it is 10 times more satisfying than simply developing something on a greenfields environment where all the conditions were optimal to begin with. And to me personally, as a leader and person who has to work with developers, if you flake on me, if you run because things aren't optimal, you're pretty useless to me, because I can't rely on you to deliver anything. So this here is picture of Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson creating Unix and C on a PDP-11 computer in the early 1970s. I talked about Unix at the beginning, and for me, Unix is a classic example of a well-architected system. Not to say that it doesn't have problems, because Unix does have a lot of problems. It's extremely adaptable and it's scalable at different levels. Consider this: the same kernel that you have running in your little smartphone is the same kernel that is powering the most powerful computers on Earth right now. And the reason for this is that the ideas that hold Unix together are very simple. It's got a set of concepts and ideas that you could almost say to a certain extent are timeless. And you'll find over time that timeless concepts or good ideas keep bubbling through. They keep coming to the fore. And certainly one proof of this is the fact that Windows has become more Unix-like over the past 10 years. This is the Ouroboros. It's the serpent that eats its own tail. In mythology, it's basically the symbol of the constant rebirth and death of life. And it's kind of a good analogy for the way that tech works, right? Because I talked earlier about concepts, and you'll keep seeing as time goes by that these concepts keep bubbling to the front. I talked about web services in J2EE and DCOM, and the concepts behind them weren't bad, right? I mean, microservices, one of the commentary that a guy had is microservices are distributed objects for hipsters. And the fact is, you know, they've taken the concept of a distributed object and just redone it in perhaps in an execution that is perhaps more palatable than it was at that point in time. I talked about web services. Now, most of you would basically get really upset if you had to consume a WSDL or create a new web service. But at the same time, you're using things like gRPC, right? gRPC is WSDL's redone. Protocol buffers are the new XSD schema. Perhaps the implementation is a bit better, but fundamentally the concept still stays the same. And it was Alan Kay who said that there have been no new ideas in IT in 1980, since 1980. And to a certain extent, it's maybe not really true, but what we certainly have is that the growth in IT, in computers, tends to be better improvements of existing concept, and those are the things that actually move us forward. Right, so I'm gonna finish off with this little slide. It says, "Don't piss off Poseidon." I do apologize for the language. And this is a picture of Poseidon about to smite Odysseus's ship and his crew. So if you've ever read the Odyssey, Odysseus was the widest of the Greek kings, and he was responsible for creating the Trojan horse ploy, which was used to trick the Trojans. He was greatly honored and loved by everybody, so much so that Zeus had decreed that Odysseus was to return home and that the gods were forbidden to kill him. However, on his way home, Odysseus landed on an island to resupply, and he came upon the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus. Now, Polyphemus had threatened to eat Odysseus and locked him up in his cave, but Odysseus, through his wisdom, had managed to escape, rescue his crew, and in the process, he had blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus. Now, basically, they had just managed to get out of that. They just managed to get onto their ship and sort of cast off before Polyphemus was blindly raging and throwing rocks from the shore. And the insults that Polyphemus heard actually hurt Odysseus. And Odysseus showed a weakness. He has a tendency to have a little bit of a short fuse and a temper. So he repaid Polyphemus in kind, insulted him quite badly, and also on top of that, he gave him his name. Now, Polyphemus, like any good child, goes off and goes to his father to go and complain about the fact that he'd just been bullied. And his father happened to be Poseidon. And Poseidon did what any father did. He got really upset with Odysseus. Now, Poseidon couldn't actually kill Odysseus, but what he did instead is say, well, I can't kill you, but basically I'm going to make you lose your ship, your crew, everything that you've brought from Troy, and it's going to take you 20 years odd to get home. This is a really good analogy for the way things work in the real world, right? And in business. You're often given a mandate to deliver things. And, you're given a mandate to deliver things. And what you have to realize is sometimes that the people that you work with don't have that same mandate. And if you develop a combative approach, all that happens is those people try to impede your own progress. So you can't be a bully about these things, right? You have to build relationships and learn to work with people. When you go and talk to somebody, when you want something from them, you have to remember that chances are pretty good there's 10 other people who want something from that. And if you start doing things like throwing a mandate in their face and becoming a bully, the only thing that's going to happen is that they're going to impede you. In the same way that Odysseus, by not keeping his mouth shut and keeping his temper in check, basically had his whole progress impeded. And yeah, so before I end, are there any questions?
Doesn't look like it. All right. Anybody that wanted to add anything? Okay. Yes, Jeff, you had a question.
I'm listening.
Jeff? Oh, it seems, what is your favorite platform, your favorite moment? Sorry, mic not working. So what was your favorite moment? from the last 2 years. That's the question.
From the last 2 years.
20 years, sorry.
For the last 20 years, sure. You know, it's hard to kind of pinpoint anything specifically. I mean, like, it's kind of almost cliche, but you know, there's many stops on the way if you wanna look at that, right? I think for me, an accomplishment was the first time I became a senior developer. That was a moment. The first time I got entrusted with running my own team, and I think the first time I actually delivered something on time, and had people using software. I think that's certainly something that I remember from a career perspective.
Awesome stuff. And Wayne, you had a question.
I've just got like a statement, and that is that principles really matter. All of this technology, it goes in absolute cycles. And you see the same thing disappear and come back again, which is why it is very, very important to understand things from first principle basis. You know, a lot of people say that academics don't matter, but if you've learned first principles from computer science or the theory of computing, it just serves you as the technology waves leave and come back again and go in full circles.
Yeah. Alrighty, thanks so much, Wayne. And Ali says, obviously coming back to Daryl for the 3rd time. And Peter says, meeting him is an obvious highlight. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, Alison will never let me forget about the fact that I've come back 3 times. She'll always hold it against me, the fact that they had to pay 3 commissions. So there's that. Peter, I actually didn't remember, mostly because I was not in a very good frame of mind when I talked to him. So sorry, Pete. No offense, but it is what it was. What it was.
It was some bait to get you to talk about that particular instance. So thanks for taking the bait.
So just for some background there, so Pete did my exit interview at Vitality, and his description of me later on was, "You were angry," which kind of sums it up.
Discovery can do that to you, though.
Yes.
Yeah, just Julian, don't make me pay another finder's fee if you just come back directly.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Alrighty. So anything else, guys, before we start wrapping up? Okay. Awesome.
So let me wrap up there. You know, so it's worth going out to say that, I mean, 20 years is not quite the end of the journey, and there are going to be a lot more mistakes, and hopefully there's going to be more successes. And I hope that that you realize that, like, what you know is only a fraction of what you could know, and hopefully that something I've told you here will help you on your own journey.